Thomas Sowell is wrong about Ebonics and he misunderstands some of the fundamental elements of black culture in America. And we're going to use an article by a scholar named Udoka in his analysis of Igbo culture and civilization to articulate the point that American Africans are deeply rooted in a continental, infra-Saharan African cultural background. So, for black folks at the cookout, one-pot cooking practices, extra helpings of collard greens, a healthy incorporation of pepper spices, and even hot sauce are not just random preferences. Traditional soul food cooking is an inheritance which enslaved Africans passed on through their descendants once they were brought to the U.S., and this can be traced directly to Igbo cuisine. Many people are familiar with several staple foods that African Americans regularly consume, such as rice, yam, black-eyed peas, watermelon, bananas, and plantains. But what a lot of people don't know is that none of these foods listed are indigenous to the Americas. During the Middle Passage, Western kidnappers intentionally took several crops native to Africa and made limited proportions of these foods available on the ships in order to keep enslaved Africans alive. Once in the Americas, the enslaved Africans used their knowledge to continue to grow these crops on the plantations as food sources. Frequently producing, consuming, and selling these crops, such as watermelon and black-eyed peas, these foods became tied to their identity and served as symbols of abolition and emancipation for free black people after the American Civil War. Some, such as watermelon, would also be turned into stereotypes via racist media portrayals. Meanwhile, in Igbo land, during the course of all these events, the basic staple crops were primarily yams and palm oil, and secondarily beans, green vegetables, cocoa yams, plantains, bananas, okras, and watermelons. Though the majority of these foods now show up in the Americas, descendants of Igbo at the time did not have the access to cultivate plantains, pawpaws, and bananas initially due to perishability and the fact that those crops would be mainly brought to Central America once refrigerated ships were available. For African Americans, some of the staples such as palm oil were replaced with butter and lard, while new staples such as maize and cornmeal indigenous to the Americas were adopted entirely. Yet still, the consumption of staples such as sweetened mashed potatoes in the black American diet remains reminiscent of the consumption of pounded yams in West Africa. The frequent use of gravy for the consumption of mashed potatoes, vegetables, and cornbread by African Americans is analogous to West Africans' use of pounded yam and fufu or akpu to devour stews and soups. And here you can see that the diets are not all that different. Perhaps the main difference between American Africans today and Igbos is the latter's traditional consumption using hands. Okra, commonly eaten as soul food, comes from the Igbo word okuru. People in other parts of Western Africa knew and grew the vegetable, but it was the Igbo expression that was the most common name that was anglicized to okra in the English language. Okra, yes indeed, has an African etymological origin in the Igbo language, and the etymology of many African American vocabulary words just deals a death blow to Thomas Sowell's claim that Ebonics came from poor whites in Britain. Moving on, enslaved Africans frequently used okra to thicken stews and soups, with even Thomas Jefferson adopting okra in his garden after learning from his African captives. African arrivals in America commonly boiled greens in pork fat, and seasoning with a combination of whatever vegetables were available at the time. This was no coincidence, as is the usage of leafy green vegetables in diets is the most common on the African continent. Even to this day, the recipe for southern collard greens mirrors the recipe for steamed vegetables in Igbo land. The ingredients for collard greens for African Americans are butter, chicken stock, garlic powder, onion powder, pepper salt, and green vegetables. The ingredients for steamed vegetables in Igbo land are vegetable oil, Maggi stock, seasoning, spices, onions, pepper, salt, and green vegetables. Even with a clear relationship in dietary patterns, perhaps a more surprising example of Igbo inheritance is actually in language. The very part of identity most African Americans believe has been lost is actually subtly present in grammatical structure. Most people assume that Black English or Ebonics is poor English due to the lack of education, but this Black English actually has a distinctive set of grammar rules, structures, and sound patterns that are not random. This has been studied and analyzed as African American Vernacular English, or AVE. Black English is more than just a vocabulary of cultural slangs and expressions like jive, lit, straight up. There are grammatical nuances. We take the following example comparing present, simple, and present continuous tenses. We all live our lives in American English. If you were to translate this into Igbo, this would be incorrect. Anyị niile bi ndụ anyị. Right? But if you use an Ebonics grammar formality, it's actually correct. And this is very, very interesting because this shouldn't happen if Ebonics is rooted in the language system of poor whites in Britain. If it's not rooted in African languages, you should not be able to establish a one-to-one translation on the behalf of its morphology or its grammatical structure. So when we look at Ebonics and compare it to Igbo, we all live our life, right? And in Igbo, this translation is correct as Anyị niile na-ebi ndụ anyị. So Ebonics grammar is actually correct using Igbo grammar rules, meaning that the grammatical structure of Ebonics has roots within African languages. If the proper English sentence of "we all live our lives" is translated word by word based on American English rules, again, it produces a sentence that is actually incorrect under Igbo grammar rules. And you can see the error in the red highlight. The present verb tense be translates to live momentarily instead of habitually. This implies a beginning and an end, unlike in English where the present simple tense tells us something that the speaker always does. In Igbo, the present tense shows an action taking place in the moment. For an Igbo person to denote lives as finite and measurable in a moment is a contradiction in the Igbo cosmological worldview of life being continuous. When we express the same concept into African American English, we obtain the continuous lives instead of live. And now when we translate this into Igbo based on English grammar rules, it actually corresponds exactly with the Igbo grammar structure. In Igbo noun forms such as ndu, there is the representation of both plural lives and singular life, which the Igbo worldview sees as one and the same. Adding s to the live verb in this example corresponds with is living, and this denotes a continuous living of the group. This is the present continuous tense that is used in Igbo to show an action that is habitual and constant. This connotes with the Igbo identifying with spirit instead of the physical body, which in the Igbo worldview has everlasting life. And now let's investigate another example of Igbo and Ebonics with English, comparing the use of copular verbs. In standard English, he is sick. If we translate this to Igbo,
Odi adia odia.
And this is incorrect. Now let's use Ebonics. He's sick. And in Igbo,
Ona adia odia.
This is correct. If we go back to standard English, she is beautiful. In Igbo, that's
Odi mara mma.
And that's incorrect. But if you use Ebonics, she beautiful.
Omara mma.
That is correct. English uses copular verbs in grammar for linking verbs from subject to adjectives or subject complements. In the first example of standard English, is the verb of to be joins he in the adjective of sick. The same is true for joining she in beautiful with is. Under English grammar rules, this is standard. However, most African languages, including Igbo, do not use the copular verbs before a qualifying adjective. When attempting to use English grammar such as
Odi adia odia.
for he is sick or
Odi mara mma.
for she is beautiful would receive confused looks from native Igbo speakers, as they intuitively can sense that this is incorrect speech under Igbo grammatical rules. In Igbo and many African languages, the verb itself is applied directly to the subject without the need for a linking verb. This is shown in the case of
Ona adia odia.
and.
Omara mma.
For this reason, when Ave or Ebonics omits the joining verb of is and says he sick or she beautiful, this is actually correct under Igbo grammatical rules. So again, using these examples, you can clearly see the African foundation and the African ancestry within African American English, and this should go without saying because obviously the enslaved Africans in North America definitely maintained some of the original phonology and morphology of their languages that survived the Middle Passage, and these communication styles descended and precipitated into what we now know as Ebonics or African American English. It's obvious Thomas Sowell's foolish, he's a non-linguist, he's wrong on this issue, and it's clear that Ebonics is rooted in an African ancestry. It does descend, the communication style at least, from indigenous pre-colonial African languages.